From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA. Well, here we are. It's another episode of Psych Health and Safety USA. And I'm just so honored today to have someone that I've admired at a distance, and particularly relative to this topic, to help those of us here in the United States figure out that while we may not have a law, we do have an American standard. So today we're going to talk about an American perspective on an international standard. And I'm just so honored to have Kahlilah Guyah, a certified environmental health and safety consultant, speaker, and CEO of PH&S Compliance Services, and out of Austin, Texas. And I first had the opportunity to meet Kahlilah in passing. So we were both at the National Safety Council Congress and Expo, and we just happened to be speaking in the same room. And I'll never forget it. So I'm kind of coming in trying to figure out where I'm supposed to be after having done a few other things. And there's this nice lady who's just done a presentation, and we're kind of, passing the mic from one to another. And how could I possibly have been so lucky and had an opportunity to listen to you a while after about this standard. So I thought I'd invite you on, and I'm going to dive right into it. My first question to every one of my guests is, who is Kahlilah Guyah?
Well, firstly, let me say, David, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you, someone who also has done a lot of research and is an expert in this topic. So thank you so much. So as you said, my name is Kahlilah Guyah. First, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a mom of two young adults, or, young people, a 13-year-old daughter and a 15-year-old son. And I am also an environmental health and safety consultant, as you mentioned. I am the CEO and founder and principal consultant at EHS Compliance Services. We are a boutique consulting firm that helps manufacturers create and implement strategies to protect workers, the environment, and most importantly, corporate reputation. Because all of this boils down into how your corporation is seen by its stakeholders. So we specialize in compliance and management system audits, specific around ISO 45001, and included in that is the guidance document ISO 45003, which I know we're going to jump into today. Right. We also provide risk assessments and really focus on that integration of mental health, mental well-being into health and safety programs, as well as workshops and training. So we provided that for manufacturers across industry sectors, including companies in the automotive sector, in pharmaceuticals, biotech, and food and wine, because I was based in the South San Francisco area for about 7 years. So I had the opportunity to work in Napa, which was super fun. And so we've been doing this for about 10 years. Doing environmental health and safety consulting. And over the last 3 years, we've done some work incorporating those psychosocial risks and factors into the work that we do. So it's an honor to be here with you.
Outstanding. Wow. It's got to be interesting to be able to hang out with the folks in Napa Valley. That probably creates some very interesting conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And interesting, dinners and lunches and those types of things as well. So
yes, it's always nice to be able to do a tasting while you're at work.
Absolutely. So let's go there. What does psychological health and safety, what does that mean to you? Does that concept mean to you?
Obviously there's the technical definition, but when we think about injury and ill health, let's start with that. Injury and ill health, according to the standard, the ISO 45001 standard, is, any negative impact to the physical, cognitive, or mental well-being of a worker. So when we think about that, my definition is really integrated to that. How do or how does what we do at our workplaces impact the worker from a holistic perspective? In many cases, as environmental health and safety professionals, we are really focused on the physical elements of the workplace, slip, trips, and falls, or exposure to electrical hazards, or exposure to chemical hazards. But for the most part, we are pretty it's rudimentary, or we're really in the elementary stages, at least here in the US, on from an environmental health and safety consultant and professional perspective of understanding the psychological and mental health impacts of the workplace. So for me, psychological health and safety is being able to understand those psychosocial factors that are specific to our workplace and how they impact the worker, and more importantly, what we as environmental health and safety professionals can do to mitigate those risks and improve our businesses.
Mhm, mhm. So this kind of holistic approach, I've had some discussion, again, more so with folks outside of the US.
Mhm.
So why is it, or is it any different here than it is in other places around the world in terms of that recognition?
Yeah, so what I've been able to come up with, and I am by no means an expert at every facility in the United States, but based on the ones that I've worked with here in the States, a lot of what we do is very compliance focused.
Mm,
So our approach over the years, and I think that has been shifting and changing more recently, has really been focused on OSHA compliance, or from the environmental perspective, EPA compliance, and obviously OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, for those who might not know that acronym, and EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. So those are the regulatory agencies here in the States, from a federal perspective, that govern workplace safety and environmental health and safety. And so for most companies in the United States, that has been the focus. And they don't really have a risk based approach from a compliance perspective. And so I think companies have generally thought that if they comply with the regulations, then they will address their risks. And
mm,
we, as environmental health and safety professionals, know that that is not necessarily the case, because if you think back to the Hard Rock collapse,
mm, mm,
that company did not have one OSHA citation. And
mm.
yet there was a collapse of an entire structure.
Right,
So we know that risk is not necessarily equated with compliance.
right.
And so I think that's the difference here in the States. I know in the UK and some other countries, they're more risk focused. It's about looking at your organization and what the risks are, not necessarily what regulations you need to comply
Mm,
with.
mhm.
And so, in my approach, compliance is a piece of the risk pie, but it's not the only piece of the pie that we need to address. And
Mm,
so, I think from what I've seen, that's the difference, is
mhm.
that we are more compliance focused here as opposed to risk focused.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of been my thought. I can't say I created it, that a lot of folks in the US, and actually I think around the world as well, they do safety for one of three reasons. Option A, it's a great idea. It's wonderful for people. It's the right thing to do. Option B, it's going to save me a bit of money,
Mhm.
because there are, I'm particularly in the for-profit environment. If I don't get people at work injured, then I will save in terms of my profit margin. And then finally, there are those who do it because they kind of have to. And at least my view, is similar to yours, that we're so focused on the last one that we forget about the other two. That
Mhm.
if you do the first one, you'll get the other two. If you do the right thing, you're going to save money. You're certainly going to, you know, uh, help yourself from a compliance perspective if you simply don't get folks hurt, and you're absolutely going to save money. So
Absolutely.
I think that one of the differences, at least in my own head, is that a lot of places around the world actually do have compliance around this topic as well as the risk-based focus. They have both.
Right.
And
Right.
it kind of, I started to figure out that these other folks around the world, it's not that they're doing it any better or worse than we are necessarily, because I think there
Mhm.
are probably some folks who do this well, but I think they have a little bit better guidance And one of the guidance, documents that people are starting to use in other places that I want to talk to you a little bit more in detail about is ISO 45003. And as I shared, I've not run into a lot of particularly traditional EHS professionals, safety professionals, however people describe themselves, who have ever even heard of the standard or certainly read through it or have the depth of background and understanding that you have. So tell us a little bit about, 45,003, the structure, kind of how it's set up and how it came to be.
Yes. So let me start with ISO 45001,
Okay.
which is the standard for health and safety management systems, or occupational health and safety management systems. And very similar to the other ISO standards, if the audience is familiar, it's based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, or PDCA. And so just high level plan is where we look at our risks and opportunities. And we decide as an organization, what are our high risk opportunities and what are we going to do about those high risks. And it's not just the high risk. Actually, we look at our operation, we identify all of our risks, and then we rank them based on that hierarchy. And so then in that do phase, we're actually executing those plans that we created in the plan phase. Okay, in the check phase, we're saying, how did we do? How's our plan working? We're measuring our performance. And then in the act phase, we're saying, okay, did we meet our objectives or did we not? And if we didn't, what do we do? And if we did, great, hooray. Now let's move on to some lower risks for our organization. So that's a very cursory overview of that PDCA cycle. And it's looking at the ISO 45001 standard, all risks to the organization from an occupational health and safety perspective. So I mentioned to you before we started recording that if we think about the definition of injury and ill health, it is a negative impact or the potential for harm when we're looking at the cognitive health of a worker, the mental health of a worker, and the physical health. So all three. And as health and safety professionals, we've traditionally been really well versed at those physical elements of the workplace that injure workers, but not so much from the psychological, mental, and cognitive health of a worker. So that's where the standard or the guidance document 45,003 came into be, to help professionals to figure out, how do we assess psychosocial risks at the workplace? How do we plan to address them? What should we do? And then how do we check or monitor our performance? And then what do we do when we find out we're doing well? Or on the converse, what do we do when we're not doing so well, when we find out that we're not meeting our objectives? So that was the purpose of the 45,003 standard, was really to help organizations and professionals, number one, identify what those psychosocial risks are and provide a methodology to incorporate them into the health and safety management system. So hopefully that at least helps to give a high level overview of the purpose of the standard from my perspective. Now, you may ask other professionals and they may say something different, but that is my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I understand that you followed the process of 45,003 being created, or so chat a little bit more about specifically how that one, because there are obviously other standards in other countries around the world, but there really wasn't anything that was global in nature. So talk a little bit about how that process kind of came together, and at least, to your understanding.
Yes, well, I was not on the technical committee or anything like that, but like all other ISO standards, there's a group of multinational folks, right? So people from across the globe, which is why it's a global standard, that come together and they, have discussions on what this standard should look like and what should be included. And there's agreement, there's consensus around what that standard should have. And so, there was not an international standard for occupational health and safety before ISO 45001. There was OSAS, which was not an international standard. There's ANSI Z10, which is more American focused.
Sure.
And, ISO 45001 does have a lot of those elements for ANSI Z10 for those who are familiar with it. But again, it's a consensus standard that's been adopted across the globe. So there were folks from a lot of different nations at the table that discussed this vernacular to make sure it spoke to not just the American population, because we have a compliance-based system here in a lot of cases and across the world that may or may not be the case. So where compliance and regulatory organizations do not exist, these folks, those organizations that sit or have sites in those places where they're not regulatory bodies can still use this standard as a guidance to create an occupational health and safety management system.
Sure. And it's such a fascinating environment that we're in from a safety perspective. As you talked about, being so compliance focused without, again, from a psychosocial perspective, it seems like it's a challenging environment to be in when you're trying to implement a larger standard, 45001 or Z10, or simply trying to meet the OSHA standards, which isn't, for some organizations, that's really the foundation for them. It gets really interesting for those of us who live in states that are kind of OSHA states, which is, at least in my view, shorthand for we really don't do much, but we kind of say we follow OSHA sometimes. That's kind of been my experience, particularly for smaller organizations who they know there's an OSHA out there. They know that, there's a standard out there. Many have never read it. Many are not necessarily certified. This is some of the conversation I have with folks, particularly in these larger safety organizations, about these standards come out and they sometimes forget about the fact that there are a lot of really small employers who do not have a safety professional at all. They have someone who's doing, you pick it, HR, or the floor manager or whoever they might be. And they look at them, they go like, hey, we got to do that safety thing. You're going to take care of that. And they go, okay, that accidental kind of safety professional. And when you have that kind of open gap that people have to fill, it becomes more complex when you start talking about, are we concerned about how people feel at work? So talk a little bit about, in terms of just your understanding, awareness about that whole psychosocial side. What do you think about that? What do you think some of the issues that folks may be experiencing even right now? They've not really identified it as a safety hazard, but it probably is. So talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we think about our current events, if we think about what happened in Buffalo,
Right.
Now, you and I are both African American. I
Right.
believe we both identify as Black Americans.
Yes.
My ancestors came to the United States through the Atlantic slave trade. As I know, not all Black people who are here in the States, that may not necessarily be their history, but that is mine. And so when we think about the impact to Black Americans or Black people in the workplace as they see violence play out in the media, whether that is what we know happened in 2020, the murder of George Floyd, or the murder of Breonna Taylor. And those are just very high profile names, but we as Black people have this experience over the last 200 years in this country of seeing people that look like us murdered and killed. And so if we think about the impact to the worker who shows up, who might look like me, and how they might show up to the workplace feeling after having seen just regular folks go to the grocery store and be killed, the amount of fear that that can incite, the amount of anxiety it can incite. Now, it wasn't something that happened at the workplace, but we have to think about the fact that we can't separate people's personal lives from their professional lives. We are one person who's having an experience in this world, whether the impacts come from our personal life, using that in quotes, or our professional life. So, if you think about folks that showed up to the workplace after that happened, even if they are not Black American, they saw it, they can be impacted by that. It's going to impact their emotional well-being. Most likely in a negative way. And so we as workplaces can't just negate that. We can't act like that's not happening. We can't act like it's not going on. We may not always be able to do something about the circumstances that people are experiencing and that are happening around the country, but we can acknowledge and recognize that they may impact our workers. If we think about the war in Russia, in Ukraine, that's been the Russian and Ukrainian war. I have friends who are from Ukraine. I have friends who are from Russia who, have to go to work every day. They may have family that's over there that they haven't been able to contact or be in communication with because of some of the challenges with the systems that are down because of the war. So those are just two examples where, certain demographics at the workplace may be impacted. So that's just related to current events. The other thing I think we should think about are learning differences. When we think about people who may have learning differences, I'll use dyslexia as an example because my daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia when she was in first grade. And it wasn't until I really started to research and understand dyslexia, a little light bulb went off. And actually that is what started this journey for me to really understand psychosocial risks, because she was diagnosed with dyslexia. She may or may not be able to understand something that she reads. And so as the health and safety professional who is presenting training and education to workers, I started to think, what if someone in my workplace or who's receiving training from me has a learning difference? I'm just assuming if I put up a slide, they understand the slide, but that's a huge assumption.
Yes.
And it may not necessarily be the case. And so 20% of people have dyslexia. That's a huge population.
Wow.
And so if that is true in our workplaces, then there's most likely people who are experiencing challenges with reading documents or training, and we may not even be including that in how we identify the risks. So anyway, those are three examples where I think that it's important that we think about the impact to the worker, even if it's not something that's happening at work.
Sure.
And then you think about all the interactions that happen at the workplace that can impact workers from a psychological perspective, whether those are microaggressions or cultural incompetence. And a lot of times microaggressions are received because the workplace and the workplace population are not culturally competent. Right? Because people just do not understand the differences across cultures. And, just because people look the same doesn't mean they're a monolith. And so just because you and I are both Black Americans does not mean we have the same experience. Or that something that I perceive as a microaggression will be perceived by you in the same way. And so just helping our workplaces become more culturally competent, I think is a really great foundation for helping to address psychosocial risk. Now, I know you didn't ask me to even get into how we can address risk, but for me, it's kind of like,
it's connected.
A total package. Exactly.
It is. And again, we as safety professionals have a lot of conversation about biological, chemical, ergonomic, physical, and safety hazards. There's books, there's training, there's all kinds of discussions about those five. And literally none, again, in the US, from my perspective, literally none about that sixth hazard, psychosocial hazards. And at least one of the definitions I'm aware of is that a psychosocial hazard is something that is perceived or experienced by the person as a threat to their health and safety. And it's that perception and experience that you just talked about. It's just different. There are 8 billion plus people on the planet, and all of our experiences are different. There are no two people, even identical twins. Not every single solitary thing about them is identical. And so it's an interesting not really a contradiction, but an interesting conversation about the fact that we have to create standards to start somewhere, but the standards have to be applied individually if we're going to get somewhere. It is, because people simply see these things different. And at least in my interactions with folks, there's this thing, we can't have a system that fits everybody. Well, you actually can if you choose to. And sometimes it requires making a connection between how people are feeling about things and how it kind of shows up in terms of, the things that we actually recognize. So can you talk a little bit about how some of the ways that people are feeling actually affect their physical health and affect their physical safety? What's the connection, at least from your perspective?
Absolutely. Well, I love that question because, our bodies are connected with our minds.
Sure.
And so anything that's happening in our mind will affect our body and vice versa, right?
Sure.
So there are some statistics around those folks who perceive experiencing discrimination. There is a biological impact. So there's a higher risk of high blood pressure. There's a higher risk of cancer. There's a higher risk of negative health implications. And so that is just from folks that perceive they have been discriminated against. Okay. And it's not specific to a specific demographic. It's just if an individual feels that they have been discriminated against, there is a higher potential for them to have negative health outcomes. The other thing is that folks who perceive discrimination also have a lower self-control tolerance. So this indicates an impact to or a higher risk for, I should say, addictive behaviors. So substance abuse and self-harm and tobacco use. And so we know that where there's a higher propensity for substance abuse, that relates directly to mental health, psychological health. And again, it's all connected. So once there's a psychological impact from a substance, then your physical health is impacted from that as well. And so I think what this speaks to is not just, hey, physical health is one thing, psychosocial risks are another, or psychological health is one thing. But what we see here is that, one can affect the other. And so to your point, if workers are experiencing psychosocial risk factors, whether outside of the workplace, that can be exacerbated inside of the workplace, it will affect their physical health. But then if we think about the focus, if folks are working in more high hazard operations and their brains are focused on what did I experience just now in this meeting? Someone said XYZ to me and it was offensive and they didn't feel safe enough to speak up and deal with that at the time, then that is going to take part of their minds off of the operation at hand, which then actually can increase the risk for higher accidents at the workplace. Right. So it's connected in so many ways that, we have just now started connecting the dots from a management system perspective, but it's been there all the time, that connection from the physical health and the psychological health and how that can impact the workplace and the worker that's at the workplace.
Absolutely. Wow. As you were speaking, the thought that came to my mind is this discussion we're having around the global pandemic that we've all experienced and continue to experience at some level. And I'm of the opinion that the pandemic didn't change anything. It just exposed virtually everything. And a lot of what we have seen come to the fore, and you talked about it earlier, the fact that, George Floyd was not the first Black person to be the victim of violence from the government and from law enforcement. He's just one of the first that we all kind of had to watch because we couldn't go anywhere. Right. And that in and of itself has created this kind of conversation around, certainly around, the importance of Black lives, and we've had a conversation about how it's important for us to feel good in the workplace. But I guess I'm also interested in, as we say that we're coming out of it or getting used to it or whatever, how do you think we start to, this connection you were talking about? How do you think we start to make that more a part of the system as opposed to some one-off that, from a safety perspective, yeah, we want to make sure that people don't have slips, trips, and falls, but how do we really do that integration and kind of help people figure out that they are as connected as you described earlier?
Right. Well, thanks for asking that, because I think that's so important. And that is one of the things that I really focus on in the work that I do, is this integration of the mental well-being, the psychological health and safety of workers into the health and safety program. So it's not much different than you would integrate any other safety metric or safety hazard, right? So if we know that workload, as an example, is one of the psychosocial factors that we hear. I'm not sure about you, but it's one of the things that I hear quite a bit, that people have more work than they have time for. They have more work than they have resources for, whether those are financial resources or resources, tools, and equipment that they need to do their job, that they just have too much to do and not enough time to do it, or not enough support to get it done. And so when we think about that as one example, that's not hard to integrate. The challenge is the workplace willing to make the changes necessary to ensure that workers have just the right amount of work that they can complete in the time that's been allotted for them. So, it's pretty easy to do a workload study. It's pretty easy to ask individuals, what are the tasks that they have to do? How long is it taking them? And compare that to the amount of time that they actually have on a weekly basis, whether they're a part-time professional, a full-time worker, or something in between. That's not really hard to do. The challenge is, once we get the data, ranking that in comparison to the other risk factors that we have, and then making a decision that we're actually going to put the resource in place to make the changes. So it's really easy to say we have a commitment to our employees. Right. It's really easy to say we have a commitment to the physical safety of our employees, but it's a whole nother thing to do a machine guarding assessment and then to implement the fixed guards or the light curtains or whatever the case may be. That's capital investment. Right. There's some money, there's some dollars that have to follow it. So it's great that a lot of companies have identified the importance of psychological health and safety. And now that evaluation needs to take place, that assessment of those psychosocial risks. So that's what we start with, the assessment. And then once we do the assessment, we can rank those psychosocial risk factors from a priority. And then we can also look at our risk matrix from our organization and decide whether these risks are tolerable or not. And then if they're not, those are the ones that we need to do something about. Right. And so it's not hard, it's not complex, but it does require some commitment of resources, both from the talent perspective, because actually somebody needs to go and do these assessments. And it also requires a commitment from a resource perspective. And so that's the biggest challenge. It's not what my grandmom used to say, it's not easy, but it's simple.
Right. Wow. Not easy, but it's simple. I may have to remember that one. Wow. So what do you think? Do you think we have any possibility here in the US
Mhm.
of either widespread adoption of 45,003 or even 45,001, to be quite honest.
Mhm.
Do you think is there hope that way, or how do you think both these standards can help us as a foundation for those organizations who actually do want to do a better job?
Right, right. So let me just offer this. So 45,001 is the standard. 45,003 is the guidance document for psychosocial risk implementation or
Sure,
incorporation into that standard.
sure.
So for organizations that want to make a change, I think that the standard is a great approach. It lays out a methodology for you to incorporate psychosocial risk into your health and safety program. I think the real benefit will be for us as safety professionals to educate ourselves more on psychosocial risk so that we can lead the charge.
Mm, mhm.
Because I think that if we are able to do that, and organizations can include this in their health and safety program, as opposed to another initiative that requires another department, that requires more resources, as opposed to adding it to the existing safety program. And I do think, based on what we've already talked about, that it's a natural fit. But obviously, there is some education that's required for a lot of health and safety professionals, maybe not all. And I think the other point I should make is that we don't necessarily have to become experts, but we can
Mm,
tap into experts, right? So I have someone on my team, Georgia Bryce. She is a licensed mental health professional.
mm.
And so I am not a licensed mental health professional, but where there is that integration, I can tap into her as a professional resource that can
Mm,
help us identify those risk factors to the psychological health of workers and include it in what we're already doing. And so
right.
I want to make sure that I highlight the fact that, yes, there might be an education piece for us as health and safety professionals, but there's also the opportunity to connect with other folks in our organizations that are critical to the success of moving psychological health and safety forward. So that's our people organization, our human resources organization.
Mm,
A lot of times they are tasked with the psychological health and safety, but they don't necessarily have the risk assessment tools that we do as
right,
safety professionals, right?
right, right.
So we definitely should tap into our human resource partners, and then we always typically at our organization have an employee assistance program. A lot of companies have that. But what I've seen is that's kind of like the last resort,
Mm,
as opposed to being integrated and looking at what we can do from a preventative measure and putting it
right.
more in the front end, how we can begin to build psychological resilience in our workers, how
Mm,
we can begin to build a system that includes, mental health first aid or
mm,
psychological health and safety task force members that can begin to spot situations that may be psychologically negatively impacting the worker, and kind of put that into our psychosocial into our safety program for metrics and observations, so
mhm,
that when we have our management review, we can look at those
mm.
psychosocial risk factors, in addition to how many trips, slips, and falls that we had, in addition to how many ergonomic issues we had or other near misses. And so this just becomes a component of our health and safety program, not something completely new, but tapping into those other resources that we have available as well.
Absolutely. I really love what you said about uh, the importance of not reinventing the wheel and coming up with something new. The world
Mhm.
is the world is complex enough as it sits. There's
Right.
just so much to pay attention to, so many things going on in the world that we don't really have the time for yet another responsibility when we're already overworked
Right.
as it is. So
Right.
just love that, that approach that says this is simply another risk that people are exposed to.
Right.
And use the same methodology, assuming we have one already, for the other risks
Mhm.
that folks are going to be exposed to. And trying to find ways. So there's hazards, and there's how vulnerable you are to that hazard. As they start to overlap, you end up with risk, and some of that risk is going to bring us harm. So why is it that we can't think about that before we have the tragic event? I'm of the belief that we spend a lot of time trying to fix the people and not enough time trying to fix the environment that we put people into,
Right.
and trying to fix it before it hurts people or before it has a negative impact on people. It often comes up again after, again, like the horrific events in Buffalo. And it's a bit of a rabbit trail here, but I don't know anyone directly who was affected by that incident. But one of the first things that came to mind for me is, were any of the workers in that grocery store, was there a plan on how they would address workplace violence before it happened, not when it happened?
Right.
And again, I find, again, for particularly small employers, folks who are not involved in construction or manufacturing, that folks seem to feel like, well, there's not a lot here. We're pretty safe. We mopped the water off the floor and we haven't had a fire, so it's not that big of a deal.
Right.
I'm of the belief that particularly as the workplace becomes more automated, that we will have fewer physical, chemical, and biological hazards, no doubt. We'll have fewer ergonomic ones if we have less people, because but to the extent we have people either physically involved, even if they're working remotely, there are always going to be psychosocial risks, always.
Absolutely.
And those risks, always, it doesn't matter how mechanically or from an engineering perspective, how we engineer that problem out from a physical perspective, there will be situations and things and perceptions and experiences that create a challenge for folks that they're going to have to be addressed. And if we can do that on the front end, like when we hired you, we told you that this is the kind of culture that you're coming into. This is what you should expect. And this is what you should do just in case or when those circumstances come up that don't match this expectation.
Right.
Here's what you should do. So along those lines, if you think back in either your experience personally or the organizations that you've worked with or been around, can you think of a psychosocial risk that you observed or experienced, and if you could replay the tape or go back in history, or go back in the Wayback Machine, how do you think, pick one of those hazards that should be addressed in a particular way, and give folks some ideas about how they can prevent some of these psychosocial risks, just any one.
Right. Okay. Well, we talked a little bit about workload management, right?
Sure.
And I think that's one that is applicable no matter what type of organization you have. People a lot of times are overworked. They have too much to do. We just talked about adding a responsibility to health and safety professionals, right? From the standpoint of psychosocial risks. Now, I mean, if your safety professional is already overworked, or you're asking that individual to do more work than they have time to complete, then adding something else, I'm not recommending that, because that would be a psychosocial risk for that individual. But I think when we look at our organizations, a lot of times we invite people, we're hiring people, but many times we wait until the folks that are working are overwhelmed, overworked before we look at hiring. And it may not be as easy, to your point earlier, for the smaller organizations. But if we know that workload is a psychosocial risk, and we have some tools in place like a workload study, and we're doing that at some frequency, maybe it's quarterly, semi-annually, maybe it's annually, depending again on your risk tolerance. But there needs to be a conversation with the executive management on what things are important to us and what are the tools that we're going to use to keep an eye on them, so that when we begin to get in the red zone, we can quickly move ourselves back. So when we think about workload management as a factor that we, as a psychosocial risk or a psychosocial factor, I'll give an example. I was working with a company that manufactures COVID tests. Needless to say, there has been an impact to the workload as surges occur. So, a surge happens and there is a higher demand for tests. Well, initially they just were not prepared for that surge and the additional capacity that it required to manufacture more tests. And then they were also analyzing the
Mm.
test. And so once they began to understand the dynamic of a surge, I mean, they're pretty predictable. I mean, you can look at the numbers and kind of begin to see when an upward trend starts to happen. And the fact that they kind of understood after that first one what type of workload would be required, so that they could get in front of it going forward. So it might actually take an incident for
Sure.
you to get an understanding around what this looks like for your organization. But I can tell you that every organization that I've worked with, workload management has been an issue.
Mm, mm, mm.
And so is it something that organizations are, do they have a key performance indicator around that?
Mm.
Are they looking at it at some frequency so that if it is an issue, there are signs, there are metrics that tell us that our workers are overworked, and then we can put some plans in place to address that. Whether that is hiring more people or looking at alternative outsourcing, there's a number of ways that we can manage a psychosocial risk, but we first got to understand where we are. And
Right.
from my experience, a lot of organizations don't have any psychosocial risk that they're measuring. And so they can't do anything about it because they just don't know where they stand. So I would say that's the first thing, is to look at those psychosocial factors and understand which ones are important for your workplace and for the demographic of workers that you have, and then put some key performance indicators around to understand where you are, so then you can put an action plan in place to address them.
Absolutely.
Does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
It does. It does. In fact, one of the items that, as I was doing my research, so my research was on the lived experience of Black workers' exposures to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace.
Mhm.
And it was fortunate for me. I was in the process of creating an instrument to try to, basically survey or inventory the hazards that folks have been exposed to. And lo and behold, 45,003 pops up on the scene. The timing
Mhm.
worked out great. So I used it as a reference to create what I call a psychosocial hazard inventory. It is
Mhm.
a very simple inventory that says, this is the hazard. Have you been exposed to it? Yes or no? It's
Mhm.
that simple. It's not complicated at all. And in some cases, folks had no idea what I was talking about. And that's good. Because if you don't know what it is, you likely have not been exposed to it. Likely because we tend to be pretty in touch with how we feel about things.
Mhm.
And particularly those risks that we've had chronic exposure to. People know when they're being overworked. They know
Mhm.
that. And if you put
Mhm.
that in front of them and identify that as a hazard, they're going to go, that's an issue for me.
Mhm.
They know when they have, when their role is ambiguous. They know
Mhm.
that because they've lived it. They had the experience of it. So again, but I absolutely agree with what you're saying, is that we can't address a hazard or a risk that we haven't identified at all. We just
Right.
can't. But
Right.
what we can do is tap into how people feel. That's
Mhm.
important because often people don't have the language to describe, what's going on with them, but they're feeling something. And it's
Mhm.
my belief. So most of my working life I spent in fire rescue services. So I have more stories than we have time to talk about in terms of all the bad things that can happen. So
Mhm.
it's that entire lagging indicator approach to things. And so my career has kind of been like Benjamin Button. I've kind of worked backwards to figure out that at the root of most of those horrific things, somebody felt something. Somebody
Mhm.
felt something didn't seem right. Something was out of place. And instead of addressing it, it was ignored. That
Right.
was, there were folks at the Chernobyl plant that told the person who made the decision to do the test that they really probably shouldn't have been doing. That just doesn't seem like what we should be doing. And they did it anyway. Same
Right.
thing at 3 Mile Island, or with, the Columbia or the Challenger, all of
Right.
these horrific kinds of things that someone felt something, they
Mhm.
brought it up and it wasn't addressed. So
Right.
I really think that's important, is to trust our feelings about
Right.
things.
And I just have to say right there that for so long in a lot of organizations, probably not all, they're so data driven that it's really hard to trust a worker's intuition.
Mm.
So I don't know how we as a society can be more in touch with our feelings. I think we're moving in that direction.
Mhm.
But to be quite honest, I grew up in like your feelings don't matter. You
Right.
just gotta get the stuff done.
Right. Right.
We got a job to do. You got to do it done.
Mhm.
And so it's only been over the last 5 to 10 years that I really understood that if I have a gut check about something, if my intuition is giving me an alarm, I need to follow that. And so if I'm just beginning to, not that I am like everyone else, but I know that there are other people who are like me who have really been taught to ignore their feelings, to ignore their intuition. And so this is a skill set that we have to really build back into a lot of people. And it's also a skill set that we have to start to incorporate into our organizations, because largely speaking, people have been told to leave their feelings and their problems at home, to come to work and do their job. And so it has made us have a disconnected workforce in that people kind of turn their feelings off or even ignore them to the point that they're not even in touch with it any longer. And so I do think that's definitely, thank you for bringing that up, because I do think that's something that, we have an opportunity to build in our workforce and our workplaces, because largely I think we've kind of told people that stuff doesn't belong here at the workplace.
I honestly believe that we have, even from a safety perspective, we have a lot of quantitative data,
Yes.
and we've ignored the qualitative side of the data and research discussion. So again, my research was qualitative in nature on purpose. I can do numbers. I just don't think they prove anything when I'm not feeling it. Seriously,
Right.
people make decisions every single day. It's not based on, what percentage of this affects those. It is how I felt today. It is how I was feeling at the time drove my decision making. It's, my amygdala fired, and I decided to either fight or flight. It is almost instantaneous. So again, just back to this conversation, it is important that we pay attention to the qualitative data points that are available to us in the workplace. And often they're available simply by asking the question, how are you feeling? How is that working for you? We sat in our, our ivory tower, our office suite, our whatever, our safety truck, and came up with this program that it was intended to do the right thing. It was intended to be good for people. But what's left out on the Plan, Do, Check, Act is the check with the people that it's supposed to be helping. Because sometimes it doesn't land the way we intended for it to land. Actually, Stephen M.R. Covey in his book, The Speed of Trust, talks about the fact that we evaluate ourselves based on our intent. We evaluate others based on what they do. So the same thing's applying to the other person. I know my intent. They don't know what my intent is. They know how it felt to them.
To them,
And then
exactly.
to them. And so it comes really full circle. As you talked about earlier, the importance of having this holistic risk-based approach, and that we should be looking at everything this way. Just because it's warm enough for one person doesn't mean it's warm enough for another. So what can we do to adjust the temperature for that person? I worked in the nuclear power industry for a while, and one of the things we had to do during full power injuries, we had to put on an ice vest that would go on under our level A's, because to keep my body core temperature. So the environment was really warm, but for me, the ice vest kept me cool. The same thing, I believe, applies to these psychosocial risks and factors and hazards in the workplace, that we can create, kind of bubbles for people that work for them. Because if we want to retain that person, it's necessary that we do that. Otherwise, we're certainly going to lose them. So this is just such an exciting conversation that we could go all day, but we both have other things that we need to run to. So share a little bit about what's up next for PH&S compliance services and for Kahlilah. What's next for her? What's going on?
Next? Well,
Yes,
thank you for asking.
sure.
So, in light of all of this information and the excitement around psychosocial risks, I've developed something called Inclusive Safety Leadership, which I'm
Hmm,
super excited to launch. So,
great.
it really is a leadership program for environmental health and safety professionals
Hmm,
that taps into these psychosocial risks and educating us about it so we can integrate it into our health and safety program. So I'm giving a presentation at the ASSP conference in Chicago in June. It's an online presentation, so anybody can attend. They don't have to actually be at the conference to attend because it will be virtually posted. So I am really excited about that. I have a really keen interest on developing a workbook around this content for safety
hmm,
professionals because, like we've talked about, it's something that's relatively new to a lot of us, but it doesn't have to be difficult. It
right.
can be simple, maybe not easy, but
Hmm,
there's a methodology that I present that makes it a little bit more simple, following that plan, do, check, act methodology of the ISO 45001 standard and integrating that risk-based approach that we've talked about. So that's what I'm super excited about and what I'm focused on over the next 6 months to a year. I know that folks will probably be interested in it. They can visit my website, KahlilahGuyah.com or ehscsi.com if they'd like to be added to our list and get more information about it when it comes out.
thanks so much. A part of the reason for this Psych Health and Safety USA podcast is to connect the community of those of us who have interest in the topic.
Right.
And I believe that there are others just like us, others out there who are really concerned about this holistic approach to occupational health and safety, that are concerned that believe we can actually do better, that
Mhm.
we've actually done a pretty stand-up job around reducing fatalities and injuries in the workplace over particularly the last 50 years. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of work to be done to help minimize and eliminate where possible the hazards to how people are feeling. And
Yes.
the work that you're doing is really important in that regard. It'll be really interesting to see how this leadership training approach that you develop, how it starts to set for folks, because a lot of this really does start with leadership. That
Absolutely.
it's the leader that creates that environment in terms of all kinds of risk, but particularly from a psychosocial perspective, that creates this environment that says that you are safe here,
Mhm.
you are valued here. This sounds like sometimes the things that we say to children, but we say it to children for a reason, to
Right.
create this kind of safety and warmth and great development for them. I'm not sure why we stop as people grow older. And I think the 8-year-old inside all of us really needs to be reassured that we're safe here. So
Yep.
again, thanks very much for the great conversation and the opportunity for you to be able to share with others, what you've learned. And I'm certainly walking away with some things to think about going forward. And our paths are certainly going to cross. And you might find yourself getting a call from me to get back on and see how things have been going. But like I said, so again, any last words you want to leave with the folks who'll be watching?
Well, hopefully something that was said today resonated with the folks that join. Thank you so much. If you made it this far at the podcast, thanks for hanging out with us.
Right.
And I really hope that this was helpful. And if you have any questions or need any assistance, feel free to reach out to me because I would be happy to walk you through the process and the methodology that I've used. I know that David also would be happy to help you. So there's a community of us that want to help workplaces implement this so that the workers can feel safe and have the best experience at the workplace because we spend so much time, 1/3 of our lifespan at the workplace. So let's do what we can to make it a positive experience for our workers.
Well, thanks, Kahlilah, for joining us today for this episode of Psych Health and Safety USA. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels. And remember, in order to be safe, you have to feel safe. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.